Landin Semantics seminar. My name is Jonathan Bowie. I know some of you well, and some of you, the logicians, I don't know so well. So welcome. This is our main event for the year. I mean, it's a smallish group here, but there are quite a lot of people online as well. So that's the online people over there. Hello, online people. And Peter Landin's seminar, we always like to have somebody who can actually remembers Peter Landin. So we're going to hear a bit about Peter Landin from David. Yes. Those of you that never met him, he was quite a character, and you know if you've met him. You must have met him. Yes. So today we've got Professor David Pym from University College, and he's just back from a conference in Europe, Bratislava. So yes, I'm very happy that he's got back, because he said there's only one flight a day, and I've got my USB stick, and you'd be having to listen to me if you hadn't come here. So I'm sure you're all very happy he's arrived. So he's Professor of Information Logic and Security in Computer Science and Philosophy at UCL. He's a Fellow of the Institute of Philosophy at University of London School of Advanced Studies. Is that sort of Einstein style? Or? Where he's Director of the Centre for Logic and Language. He's also Director of the UCL Centre for Doctoral Training in Cybersecurity and Editor-in-Chief of Oxford University's Press Journal of Cybersecurity. And in his much longer CV, which you can read online, he says, "Trust me, I'm a logician." We'll see if we trust him at the end of this. But anyway, thank you very much. And he's going to speak on inferentialism, proof-theoretic semantics, and computation.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. Charming, interesting. Yeah, good. And thank you so much for inviting me to talk about this seminar. I mean, it was delightful to be reminded to think about Peter, and he was a really nice person. Yeah, and I think he's one of those people who is very much underappreciated by the community, and that's a great shame. I'm not quite sure what it is that makes people appreciated or not appreciated, but I can think of a lot of examples of people who aren't as appreciated. There should be. Peter is right up there.
Well, I agree.
Yes. And anyway, so it's a real pleasure to just take a bit of time to think about him. I'm going to talk about Peter a bit, but I'm also going to try to teach you some logic at the same time. Yeah. Because Peter would approve of that. Right? Yeah. I mean, he liked people to get stuck in, so let's get stuck in a bit. I'm going to talk about some sort of weird philosophical stuff, really, but it actually turns out to have quite a serious connection to computational ideas. So I hope it gives some interest. Okay, let's do it. So, yeah, I was the first thing that could be almost, so many people I've known over the years professionally been called Peter. I don't know why.
I'm Jonathan Peter, by the way.
I mean, a major colleague, Peter O'Byrne, another major colleague, Peter Schreier, another major colleague at Queen Mary was Peter Johnson, and of course there's so many Peters. I don't know why that should be true, but yeah, Peter. What do I remember of Peter? First of all, I remember his being so very welcoming to a young man from the sticks, on the wrong side of the tracks. And I was, I'd come to Queen Mary via Edinburgh and Cambridge, but I was definitely from the wrong side of the tracks, in the sense of not being from the typical UK intellectual community, and being from Derbyshire, which is mostly full of sheep, and Peter would just sit down, sit and talk, and it would be really, really encouraging and inspiring. So it's really great. What I'm going to talk about is an approach to foundational logic that is called proof-theoretic semantics, and which sits in a philosophical position known as inferentialism. And I'll talk a bit about that. But so I'm going to talk to you about it because it's what fills my life at the moment. But it also occurred to me that it's something that Peter would have approved of enormously, because of the way he thought about computation in general and programming languages in particular. And so I hope there's some kind of intellectual connection there. And it would have been lovely to have Peter here to explain these ideas to, because I think you'd like them, and at least I hope you'd like them. So yeah, so it was a great privilege to know. Queen Mary, I was very, very young and very naive and very ignorant and very arrogant at the time, but Peter was kind of, he was just accepting and encouraging and very, very kind. There was one of the many Peters I knew. It was Queen Mary, Peter Johnson, late Peter Johnson, who was married to Hilary Johnson, who is doing well, and Peter was not in the theory end of Queen Mary at all. He was a human-computer interaction person, but he was a very, very nice person. And at the time, I was living in Camden Town, and so I used to spend a lot of time in the cinemas of, Bloomsbury and stuff. So quite often you'd run into Peter Johnson, not Peter Landin, coming out of the cinema, and talk to him. One evening, Peter and Hilary ran into Peter coming out of the cinema, and Peter had a rather elegant young man on his arm, and as he often would have done, and Peter Johnson said to Peter, "Oh, Peter, is this your son?"
Yeah.
And Peter, of course, Landin, of course, just laughed and smiled and introduced his friend, and but Hilary told me this story. But the fact that Peter Landin was so generous about something that was typical of him. So yeah. So what was the perspective that was going on? So if you see what I mean, what we can see is a desire to treat languages systematically, programming languages systematically. And from the semantic point of view, operationally, we'll come back to why that's an interesting point. He also was keen on the idea of a very clean operational semantics, which you can see in something elegant like the SECT machine. But also appreciated the connections between the operational and the denotation, and something like the J operator, which is kind of continuations approach, is an example of that. You can't really, you understand the J operator, the operation, you get to a certain point in computation and you decide to go someplace else. But really it's justified in very denotation. And I remember, and these three things occurred to me because Robin Milner taught a rather beautiful course now, which was called, pretty sure it was called, I used to have a beautiful set of notes from Robin, so I can't find it anymore. But I'm pretty sure it was called Language Semantics and Computation. And what it did was connect up the SED machine, graph reduction, and structural operational semantics in the sense of blocking. And so just this triangular three-way connection, fully established, equivalence, all the way around. And that I later realized when I knew Peter that course that I attended as a graduate student was very, very beautiful, but also had Peter's influence all over it. And I wouldn't have realized that something he was not kind of credited with that in the present. And it's just an example of the appreciation. I don't recall him being particularly credited with the ideas there, but it was obvious once you knew Peter a little bit more that there was so much influence there. And I don't think anything, there was nothing, there was no attempt to mine it. It's just, the ideas were so natural, they somehow just got used as natural ideas rather than being things that had to be cited, Anyway, inferentialism. So inferentialism is a philosophical position that says that when you're thinking about languages, the meaning of the constructs in languages should be, and if you are a hard-line inferentialist only can be, understood in terms of how those constructs are used. So the grammar of natural language tells you how to construct sentences, and in the way in which you the rules which allow you to construct sentences tell you what those grammatical components mean. And when you the meaning of nouns even is not determined by some abstract interpretation of language in some abstract structure, but it's determined by the fact that when I talk about a conversation between two people, those people are referred to directly, and the conversation is something that's constructed out of their existence. So it's about inference being the grounding for meaning, and there's several beautiful books by an American philosopher called Robert. Making it explicit, articulating reasons and reasons, logic reasons. And the first one is the big book on inferentialism, kind of definitive book on inferentialism. The second one is the kind of shorter, popular book on inferentialism. And reason for logic reasons is something which connects those ideas up to logic a bit. So, but when you connect things up to logic like that, you could actually also connect things up to operational semantics in much the same way. The same story would work if you were to take the ideas in making explicit and articulating reasons and apply them to programming languages in the way that the third book applies them to logic, you would get a coherent story, and it would make a lot of sense. So I think we can argue that operational semantics really does sit naturally within an inferentialist perspective. What I'll do later on, later today, is make an explicit connection in the setting of logic programming, just to make that very real for you. Alex is smiling at the back, so that's exactly where that came from. But the point is that it is a completely explicit version of what it is in a technological setting. So I hope that'll make some sense. So let's talk about meaning a little bit. So in the sense of Tarski, the meaning of formulae comes from their interpretation in abstract models. So in this little setup, I normally have a pointer, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I forgot.
Does that help?
I don't think
it won't work online anyway, so
no, it doesn't. So I apologize. But so the idea is that if you have an abstract model, let's call it M for model, and you can ask whether in that model a formula phi is a consequence of a collection of formula gamma. And according to Tarski, that will be the case just in case the truth of all the things in gamma in the model M implies the truth of the formula phi in the model M. And if that's true, then according to the model M, phi is a consequence of gamma. Right? This is Tarski. And we can define what this means in terms of the structure of the formula phi in terms of the connectives that are used to make up the formula phi. So if it's a conjunction of the form, phi 1 and phi 2, then both of them have to be true in the model at the same time in order for that to work. So what does this mean? This means that semantic consequence amounts to the transmission of truth. The transmission of truth from a collection of formulae to a formula according to what a model says is allowed. Right? But bear in mind, this is an abstract model in the sense of mathematical model theory. Right? Yeah, it can have massive cardinality. Right? It's going to have lots of complex stuff going on. One can reasonably ask whether this is a good basis for understanding what we mean by reasoning. The inferentialist view would be maybe not so much. So that it's too.
Does it make that claim?
Sorry?
Does it make that claim?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, pretty much. And what we're going to do is develop something. Which bases which bases the idea of meaning in logic not on this notion of truth, but on the notion of validity, which comes from proof and inference. So it's going to look it's going to have some different properties. Anyway, what we're going to do is explore this the idea of whether we can replace this idea of meaning coming from the transition of truth in abstract models with something which is grounded in something, at least in principle, much simpler, which is inference. So I'm going to tell you about something called proof-theoretic semantics. The reason I'm doing that is, it's partly because it's just what obsesses me at the moment. I've done for a while, and partly because I think it genuinely does connect up to the way of thinking that Peter would have enjoyed. So I hope that's a reasonable thing to do. But so some very smart people, logicians and philosophers, Doug Provitz and Michael Dunn and Bjorn Sundman and others, have studied something which these days we locally call proof-theoretic validity, which is about asking what does it mean for a proof to be valid. And I'm actually not going to talk about this today. I'm going to talk about this other thing called what we call locally basic extensions. The truth is that proof-theoretic validity relies on the idea of basic extensions, but it's a convenient distinction for now. And it's concerned with the validity of propositions, not proofs, in terms of proof-theoretic treatments of inference. So I'm going to explain to you what all that means. And if you are someone who cares about this kind of thing, you can go away and read a paper by Alex, which explains that this is the more general view of the world. Yes, at least in a specific setting. Okay, so let's just think just a little bit. Just to a little bit more proof-theoretic validity, just so that I don't ignore it completely, and because it will move us into where we need to be to talk about what we're really going to talk about. So there's a very famous way of doing proofs called natural deduction, introduced by a German logician called Gerhard Kens. And the idea is that the idea of natural deduction is that you build proofs of propositions by using rules which either build up the formulae according to their according to which connectives are in them, or decompose the formulae according to which connectives are in them. So so if you want to build up a proof of a conjunction, phi and psi, you better have a proof of phi and a proof of psi. Then you can use a rule which bolts those together, and you get a proof of phi and psi. On the other hand, if you have a proof, let's say, that's called an introduction rule because it introduces a connective. Let's think about the other thing, which is something called an elimination rule. Well, and perhaps the most famous example is something you might know as modus ponens. It says if you've got a proof of a formula phi, and you've got a proof that of the formula that says that phi implies psi, implication, then I can use the modus ponens rule to infer that I've got a proof of the formula psi. If phi implies psi, implies psi. If I have a proof here, I get a proof of the conclusion. So this is what natural deduction does. It builds things up, but it breaks things apart. Now, there's a very beautiful mathematical theory of all of this. Some of it sits inside something called, you may have heard of, called the propositions as types correspondence. If you haven't. This all works rather beautifully, and proofs constructed using these natural deduction ideas correspond precisely to model-theoretic truth in a certain sense. You know, I can prove something if and only if it's true, and vice versa. So so that all works beautifully. It's a nice theory, but it all refers back to this idea of an abstract model. So the meaning of proofs in natural deduction is justified in terms of abstract models, abstract mathematical structures. That's fine, but it's not the only way to do things. So what we're going to do is we're going to think about these things called base rules. We're going to talk about, if I've got an atomic proposition, a list of atomic propositions, P1 through Pk, I'm going to have a so-called base rule which allows me to refer some other atomic proposition. Right, so these things are pre-logical. There's no logic in there. They're just production rules, if you like. What it means to say there's no logic in there means there are no logical connectives involved. I can give a logical interpretation of what it is to be a rule, but that's a different game. At the most basic level, this is just something which doesn't involve any logical structure. Just if I know this atomic fact through this and this atomic fact, then I can infer some other atomic fact. But what we're going to do is use that as a basis for a whole new kind of semantic. Here's an example. So anyway, I thought Tammy would be offended, so so an example of this is that, let's suppose we know that Luna is a fox atomic statement, and Luna is female, then we can conclude that Luna is a vixen. These are just atomic assertions. You don't need to know any logic to make these justifications. And we can do some other things too. So these are all just examples of these simple production rules. We can do much cleverer things with these kinds of atomic base rules. We can allow ourselves to have a whole load of assumptions, P1, so a big set of assumptions P1 from which we infer Q1, big set of assumptions Pn from which we infer Qn, and then allow ourselves to infer another atomic proposition. Everything in here is atomic propositions, no logical connectives at all. Right. The only kind of subtlety I'm allowing myself here, and this is for technical reasons which we won't go into right now, I'm allowing that these assumptions above the premises can be possibly discharged. That is to say, once you've used them, you no longer need to assume. But we won't worry about that. Okay. Yeah. This is an important class of atomic rule. There are many, many other choices of classes of rules, which I'm not going to describe at all. But this is an important class. Okay. So I'm going to now talk about this idea of base extensions. I'm not going to talk about validity proofs anymore because that's too complicated. We're going to talk about this idea of base extension semantics. So this thing on the left here, this funny symbol, validity. So I'm going to say proposition P, an atomic proposition P, is going to be valid in a base B. That is to say, I'm going to take a whole set of these base rules, as I kind of just showed you, and it doesn't even have to be finite, just a whole set of them. And I'm going to say, what is it?
So that they correspond to the hypotheses you're arguing.
That's right. Yes, exactly so. Yeah. So they're kind of the basic things you know about the world, but without having to do any logic to understand what they are. Just basic inferences that you observe. So yeah, no, but you don't need to do any fancy logic to know what they are. So that would be a strong. You've just articulated an inferentialist view of the world. That precisely. So anyway, so the idea is, what is it for an atomic document B to be valid in a base B? Well, it's that's going to be just in case we can prove P using the rules of the base. So Luna is a fox. Luna is female. Luna is therefore a vixen. And then we can just, how would we? You can imagine what we do. We just use those rules to do. We compose those rules together. Now the question is, how can we then? If this is our starting point, this is how we give meaning to atomic propositions. How can we give meaning to complex logical formulae? Remember when we started talking about the Tarski worldview, we said, a conjunctive thing would be true in a model if each component of the conjunction is true in the model. Well, we've got to do the similar trick here. And in fact, we do exactly the same trick. But all we've done is say that we know. How do we know that an atomic formula is true? Well, we only just in case we can prove it in a set of rules. We're not interpreting it in some very big complex structure. We're just saying we can prove it. And so I can now say what it is for, inductively, I could say what it is for a conjunctive formula to be true, to be valid in a base. It's valid in a base, just in case each of its components is valid in a base. Right? So in the most simple case, you take two atomic formulae, P and Q, and say what is it for the atomic formula P and Q to be valid in a base? Will be valid in a base just in case each of its components is valid. And then we can gradually, inductively, build up what it means for complex formulae to be valid in a base.
So the end is a symbol in our logic, and the AND is a kind of joining of two trees. Perhaps.
That's right. It's exactly that. Yes. Proofs carry the structure of trees typically in this kind of world, and we can if we have a leaf of a tree, just got some requirement for something to be proof-theoretic, we can insert a proof of that thing of that leaf and get a valid proof. It's an important principle of proof. Very important principle of proof. Okay, so this looks incredibly simple. But actually, it's not. It actually builds up a lot of structure. Okay, we're going very slow, so we're not going to get through so very much, but that's fine. I hope that's okay. This I'm not. I was never intending to explain this slide to you. What this slide tells you is that the intuitionistic propositional logic, which is a full logic for talking about the world, doesn't have the law of excluded middle, but it's okay. This is how you give its semantics wholly in terms of inference in using base rules. So just treat this as a piece of artwork. And what it tells you is I can give a completely rigorous mathematical semantics for intuitionistic proposition, which has the same soundness and completeness theorem that we mentioned at the beginning for truth. That is to say, you can prove something in the proof system if and only if it's true in models. The same thing is true here. You can prove this thing, you can prove a formula in the proof system, the natural deduction system we talked about, if and only if you get it corresponds, if and only if you have validity in a base. So what we've done at this point is replace model theoretic proof for the most basic important logic you can imagine with proof theoretic validity for it. And we can recover the same soundness and completeness theorem. It all makes sense. But what have we done? We've given a complete semantic treatment of the logic, but we've done away with having to think about abstract models completely. The only thing you need to build this up is the idea of an atomic inference and the idea of units. Yeah, that would be a fair point. But you need to know how to build things together. It's exactly correct. But we've completely done away with all of the requirements for abstract model theory to give meaning to things. Obviously. And I mean, just to reflect from it, I mean, what is it that when we think about computation, what is it that we think about? We think about taking some bits of data and executing a computational process and getting a new bit of data. Agreed? Well, that execution of a computational process is no more than the application of some base rules to take you from one bit of data, some collections of bits of data to another bit of data.
Yes.
That's it. So that is exactly what we're doing when we think about computation. We are in a very sophisticated, standard built up kind of way, executing base rules to make inferences about data. So, I think it's fair to say that this connection, this evident, I would argue, evident connection between inferentialist semantics and computation has not been articulated, and it should be. And Alex, I'm glad to see you now. Nodding at the back. That's good. You nodding too, now? Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so anyway, that's what I just said. You get sounds results like the kind we sorted out with you. There are lots and lots of subtleties around the way disjunction gets handled here. I think, given the time, I'm not going to tell you about them, but I would just tell you a little bit about why it's important. If I ask you what does it mean for a disjunctive formula to be true in a model, what would you expect the answer to be? I've got a formula, it's phi or psi. What condition will tell you whether it's true in a model N?
Well, either one is true or the other is true.
Right. This is the standard definition according to Tarski, according to Kripke, according to whatever. If you take that definition in the world I've just described to you, you will not get a completeness done. All sorts of technical reasons. That's because and the failure of the completeness theorem there tells you something about, I'm not going to get into it now, that'll be a whole lecture, I think, but it tells you that in a strong sense, that's an inadequate reading of what it means to be a disjunction.
Is that because you're kind of, the world you're viewing is far less restrictive than what a mathematician might be viewing, you know, just trying to describe set theory?
Yeah, I think that's right. It's really about what evidence can you obtain for, how do you know you have evidence for the correctness, the truth of a disjunction? And when you ask that question in the model-theoretic world, it gets a little bit hard. But it actually has a very clear answer in the proof-theoretic semantics world, but it's a different answer. So you get a different treatment of what it is to be, for a disjunction to be valid, compared to what it is for a disjunction to be true in a model. But it's equally justifiable philosophically, arguably more so, but it is different. Anyway, I'm not going to tell you any more about that now because that would be quite a long time. I'd like to get through and talk about logic programming and computation. But there's a story there which you can read if you'd like to about this. Just before we move on, so I've sort of been telling you about a traditionalistic propositional logic, which is just logic built out of conjunction, disjunction, implication, and the weak notion of negation that comes with intuitionistic logic. So one with the weak notion of negation which does not have the rule. So now, for many people,
accordingly, you don't do proof by contradiction.
That's right. Yes. Now, for many people, that logic is the basic truth of the world, right? And so that's why it's kind of an important one for us to start. But what in this world of proof-theoretic, because we can recover classical logic with all its law of excluded model reasoning, that's all there. We can do all of that. We get all of the completeness theorems that you expect to go with that. We can also do a whole load of logics that have become really important in computer science. Things called substructural logics, where you're not allowed to do things like assume you can use something twice, being the same as using it once, or you're not allowed to arbitrarily add extra assumptions to a deduction. You know, substructural logics don't allow you to do that. They only allow you to do that in very controlled ways. But so they're very important. They're very important in the theory of computation. But yes, they all can be treated in this world. It all makes sense. You'll have heard of things called modal logics. Who's heard of modal logics? So you talk about what it is for something necessarily to be true, what it is for something possibly to be true. All of those things could be treated in this inferentialist world, the semantic world. Again, you have to do things a little bit differently. You have to work a little bit harder, perhaps, to get the results out, but they're all there. And so we've done loads and loads of work in the last few years, taking all of these logics and showing that proof-theoretic semantics can handle them. So that's really important, I think, because what it does is that all these things which are useful for thinking about computation theory, for thinking about agency, for thinking about knowledge representation, all of this stuff actually can be viewed in this way. It's not, which is to say, this is not some kind of obscure little philosophical world which only applies to intuitionistic logics. Actually, we can make it work for all of these applied logics that people use all the time in AI and computer science. So I think it's been really interesting to make that true, actually, because we didn't know a few years ago. We didn't know. We do. There's a whole lot of category theory. See, if Edmund had been here, he would have loved this slide, but this is not for us.
Yeah.
What I want to talk about is this with you guys. So, who knows about logic programming? Yeah, who knows about resolution? Resolution is an important idea, right? Agreed? Okay, there are two ways of talking about resolution that are equivalent. One is the way you will read about in, a book by John Lloyd or something like that, which will talk about resolution as, but which in a way which amounts to something called the cut form. And what that does is it just says you can, if you have clauses which are basically lists of literals, atoms or negated atoms, and you just apply this cut rule which finds a complementary pair and collapses them, and eventually you collapse everything to the empty clause, and then you've got a proof via simple SLD resolution. So that's these proofs in proof-theoretic terms. These are cut-only proofs. Everything is done in terms of this substitution-based argument, and that's fine. It works just fine, but it works just fine pretty much only in the setting of form clauses which are for which classical and intrinsic logic basically agree. So so there's a setting there where a certain formulation of resolution works, but it's probably not giving you a very good explanation of why. So then back in the 90s, this guy, Dale Miller, came along from the University of Pennsylvania, Lane's PhD, and observed that there was another way of setting up resolution, which is very beautiful. It's what we call analytic resolution. It's called analytic resolution because we don't use cut rule at all. We use rules which are natural deduction rules. They're concerned with the introduction or elimination of connectives. So, and what he did was to set up the idea that you could talk about logic programming in terms of these things called definite formulae and goal formulae. So the definite formulae are going to be our programs. They're going to be our models of logic programming is a kind of logical model of the world you care about. And we're going to describe those in terms of these things called definite. And then what do you do with the logic program? You query it. You say, is this formula provable according to the program I've set up? So it's just what logic programming is doing is just asking whether a certain logical consequence is provable or not. That's it. That's all there is to it. So what we're going to do is have we're going to have a program P, which is going to be a set of these guys, and we're going to feed a program, a query, which is going to be one of these guys. So let's see how that works. There are going to be two kinds of rule going here. There are going to be rules which go on the right-hand side of the consequence. So remember what the consequence program entails query goal. So definite formulae entails goal formula. We're asking, is this thing provable? And what we're going to do is run inference rules backwards. So as we unpack the structure in the goal, and at the same time as we ask what kind of structure is available in the program. So we're going to, if we had a conjunctive goal formula, we talked about conjunction a lot, right? What we would do is say, if it's a goal of the form G1 and G2, I've got to be able to prove from the program both G1 and G2. Right? So first of all, I check out the conjunction and ask these two simpler questions independently.
So you're generating sub-goals.
That's right, we're generating sub-goals.
And because it's intuitive logic, maybe it's easier to do than with classical logic because you've actually got less choices. So in classical logic, at some point, you're going to have to wheel in proof by contradiction.
Absolutely right. You've identified exactly the key thing, which is that in the setting of definite formulae and goal formulae, there is an important theorem. The important theorem says that something called uniform proof is a complete way of finding all the consequences. And what uniform proof means is the following. It's really simple, actually. You unpack all of the structure in the goal until you've only got atomic formulae left, right? And you just do that. Yeah, that's a completely deterministic thing to do, right? Only when you have reduced everything to atomic formulae are you allowed to look inside the program. And inside the program, you've got formulae of the form bunch of complicated stuff implies an atom. Right, so you find one of those clauses, program clauses inside your program that matches the atom you introduce things to, and you apply a rule which says now, if I'm going to use this clause to prove that atom, I better be able to prove all of the stuff that I use as assumptions in the clause. What does that do? It gives me a whole load of complex formulae to prove as goals again. So I get a new subgoal, which is it's got a big complex formula. So what have I got to do? According to uniform proof, I've got to smash it up again until I'm down to atoms again. And only then am I allowed to look inside the program again and find a new program clause and do the same trick again. And eventually, if the goal is indeed provable from the program, I'll eventually get to the point at which there's an atom lying around in the program which corresponds to the atom I want to prove, and then I can stop because I've got the consequence of the form. This atom entails this atom. Well, that's going to be what we call an axiom, right? so this idea of uniform proof is how we can talk about logic programming entirely in terms of the structural proofs. Did I write? I might have written down an example. Yes, here it is. Here's an example. Good. We're kind of abstract. Right. So here we've got the program. It's just a collection of program clauses and an atom. And then we say, okay, because we've got an atom here, let's look inside the program and find a program clause of this form. Some complicated thing implies an atom. Same atom as here. Okay, the rule I apply, it doesn't matter what it is, says that means that I have to check that this indeed is an axiom, of course it's an axiom, and then I have to ask whether what's in the program is now able to prove this complex thing. Okay, this is no longer an atom, so I have to smash it up, like breaking up the conjunctions and so on, until I get another atom here. Then I look again inside the program. I find one of these guys inside the program, which matches this atom. Again, I observe that this is an axiom, and now I have to prove this complicated thing from the program. Okay, and I just carry on doing that until everything I'm left with is of this form, and then I finish. Now, it's also possible that I'll get to a point where all of the atoms I have in my program are different from the atom I need to prove. At that point, I'm stuffed. At that point, I failed. That's how logic programming computation fails. Sometimes they also do, but we won't go into that. So what happens is that you either succeed or fail according to whether you can actually construct proofs of all of your atoms. So that's really all there is to logic programming.
You made a very interesting statement before that we're not throwing away things like proof by computation, but we're just going to put them on one side for the moment. We will be able to recover them if necessary.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Here's a little mathy slide for those who like mathematics. The question is, from a classical model theoretic point of view, how would you go about giving a semantics to this notion of computation? Okay. Well, it's interesting. So what I've written, I'll explain how it works in a minute. But what I've done here is construct a model in the classical sense of a model in model theory, in mathematics, an abstract model, except it's one built out of the language of the program. Right? It's what we call a term model. And it's what we use to prove completeness. We prove a completeness theorem for a class of models by constructing an instance of that class of model out of the language of the logic, and then claim ourselves to be very clever by observing that the things we could prove about the language of the logic correspond to the model we constructed out of the language of the logic, which sometimes is a very hard thing to do, but is in some sense never a very clever thing to do. Right. So that's what goes on. That's the game of proving completeness theorems in logic. But in the setting of logic programming, it's perhaps got a little bit more content to it in some sense, in that what we do is we say, first of all, we're about proving atoms. Right? That's the whole point. So let's look at the set of all atoms that are available to us. okay, in a language of logic, just every atom you can imagine. And that's called the Operan universe. And what we're going to do is define an interpretation of programs inside the Operan universe. Now, that just says we take a program and we assign to each program a set of atoms. And the idea is that we're going to construct exactly the set of atoms that the program can prove. And then we'll declare ourselves to be very clever because we'll have proved that the program constructs a complete model in some sense. So how do we do that? Right. Well, the trick is this thing here. Suppose at some point I'm going to do it in construction by induction, and at some intermediate point, I've assigned a set of atoms to a program. That's going to be the set. Think of it as the set of atoms that so far in my construction the program can prove that I know so far. But it's not everything yet. I have to do a bit more work to get everything. So what I do is this: I say, I've got a set of atoms, and that's the set at the next stage in my construction. You know, I've got a bunch of things the program can prove so far. I'm going to do another step in a computation and ask what atoms can I add to the set of atoms that I already know about. Okay, I need to add some more.
Is this the opposite of generating subgoals?
This is exactly the opposite of generating subgoals. Yes, it's asking.
What else I know?
Yeah, what else do I know? It's a good way. Yes. So I'm going to say, okay, what things can I add? I'm going to add to the set of things I've got so far just those atoms that come as follows. Either there's a thing, either there's an implication. Oh, did I miss something?
You missed an A, M, P.
Yeah, that's right. Sorry, thank you very much. Either the atom is already in the program, or there's one of these. There's a program clause in the program which has conclusion A, and which has the property that the program P is capable of proving the goal form, capable of proving the complex form. So this is exactly the unpacking of this is exactly this step of unpacking. Either the atom is already in the program, or there's a thing inside the program such that the program proves the complex thing. So what we're doing in constructing this thing is just iterating that rule as many times as we possibly can to get all of the possible atoms we can construct out of it. Now, we're doing all this inside. Okay, so I described this as the Operan universe as the set of atoms. I'm going to take the power set of that, so the set of the subsets of it. If I define my interpretations in some way, it's something I get something called a complete lattice, and by Tarski's theorem, I can define an operator on the complete lattice, and that operator will have some properties that particularly will be continuous, and that means that I can apply Tarski's theorem. I don't use Remonset, but I can apply Tarski's theorem, and I find that there is a fixed point of this operation. That is to say, there's a fixed point of this step, and what that means is that if I carry on doing it, eventually I'll stop adding new stuff. That is to say, I'll have found all of the things that the program can prove. That's the meaning of the program. All of the things that can prove as constructed in this way.
These things might be syntactically different.
Yes.
As opposed to semantically different. How does it go?
So two programs which are syntactically different could have the same meaning. Yes.
So when it's sorry.
Sorry. I mean, this is probably a very, very obvious question. Is all that you've just said pretty much could be summed up what's usually known as the closed world assumption?
It's very closely related to the closed world assumption. Yes, the closed world assumption is a good question. The closed world assumption is about how you understand negation. Really, it's really about how
that's right.
This context. So in logic programming, there's this idea of what's called negation as failure.
That's right. Yes.
And what negation of failure means is that you interpret the negation of a formula as the inability to prove the formula.
That's correct.
That is only, in a strong logical sense, that is only correct in the presence of the closed world assumption.
That's right. Yes.
The
Yes.
closed world assumption is that you have in your language everything that there is to know.
That's right. So in other words, if you introduce a whole lot of P's up to Pn, say, you can't sneak in another thing called Q, which can't be proved from P. That's what it's saying, really, isn't it?
It's saying the only things that are going to be true are the things you can construct proofs of.
That's right.
And the way we're going to choose to interpret negation in this setting is as the failure to construct a proof.
So you can't sneak in another atom, in other words.
That's true.
That's
Yep.
that's what it really means, isn't it? You can't sneak in another atom. You've got all the atoms and then all of the things that come from the atoms, but you can't sneak in another one, and that's it.
It's saying, it's in a kind of information sense. It's saying that everything you can possibly know about the world you're talking about is represented in the clauses of the program.
Sorry to interrupt.
Sorry?
I said sorry I interrupted.
Quite all right.
Yes,
Very well.
it's nice to get linked up with, things that you already know, kind of thing.
No, it's great. Thank you. It's a nice question. I appreciate it. Okay, so let's just we've got a few minutes, so let's just take a few minutes. Now, don't worry about this. Let's go to here. If we build in a purely logical setting a completeness theorem for intuitionistic proposition using basic extensions, we can do that completely, and a priori it has nothing to do with what we've just been talking about around logic programming. Right? There's no reason to make any assumptions around logic programming or anything like it to set up to prove the completeness theorem for the basic extension semantics for intuitionistic propositional logic. It's just we take natural deduction, which proofs of intuitionistic logic formulae, and we construct a base for which validity in that base corresponds exactly to provability in the proof system. So it's a standard completeness theorem. It has all the familiar components of completeness theorem, except for the fact that our basic notion of proof of an atomic formula is replaced by validity of an atomic formula in the base, provability in the base, and the construction of a term model is replaced by the construction of a special base, which is precisely the one that corresponds to the proofs you can do in the proof system. Right. So what's that got to do with logic programming? Turns out it has a lot to do with logic programming, although you might be surprised. So a base rule, just the thing we started out with, 50 minutes ago, around 45 minutes ago, a base rule actually P1 through Pn infer P can actually be written in logical terms. So we move from pre-logical to a logical interpretation at this point, as the conjunction of all of the assumptions implies the conclusion. Agreed? Yeah. Happy with that? Now, that guy there, that's a definite formula in the sense of the logic programs we were just talking about. That's a clause, that's a program clause. This is one of the complex G's we were working with when we were unpacking a computation, and this is just an atom. Agreed? So, and now, believe me, please, when I tell you that, all of the base rules we'll ever consider in our intuitionistic logic setting are examples of definite form. So it turns out that we can prove the completeness of this kind of semantics for intuitionistic logic using precisely the logic programming completeness theorem I just explained to you, the one with the least fixed point, the one with the fixed point of the resolution operator. That is exactly a way to construct a completeness theorem that's got nothing to do with logic programming. So there is a deep connection between the way in which we give semantics for logic programs and this notion of proof-theoretic semantics for logic studied in the wrong way. And that, I think, tells us that there's something quite important about computation. It's got a real connection to a notion of correctness in logic that a priori has nothing to do with. It turns out computation is a very powerful tool for reasoning. Computation in this case in the sense of logic programming, in the sense of depth. So, okay, so that's a connection I wanted to try to explain to you. So there is all of this, there are some other things I could talk about, but I think we'll stop now because everybody's getting tired, I suspect. But there is a connection that is deep and beautiful between a philosophical position that leads to a reformulation of the foundations of logic and a computational interpretation of logic, in this case in logic programming, that provides really useful techniques for proving properties of systems of logic. So you might, and this kind of computation, this is computation in the sense of that Peter Landin would have recognized of operational semantics. So operational semantics turns out to be deeply connected to the foundations of logic, which I think is an interesting fact to take away. You might, I mean, if you were to go into a maths department and ask them, is there a connection between the foundations of logic and the operational semantics of programming? People kind of response you get, they would be wrong. There is a very deep connection, and I think I very much hope that this is something that Peter would have appreciated. This is an area of logic that's only emerged in the way I've been talking about today in the last couple of decades. It has a much deeper history back to Martin Love, 70s, early work on iterative theory of intuition, inductive definitions, stuff like that. There's a very deep history of what it means for studying what it means for a proof to be valid. But this stuff that I've been talking about today, we're calling basic semantic thing, only has a couple of decades of history. So it would have been very, very late in Peter's experience. But I hope it would have meant something to him if we'd had the chance to. Right?
Are there any more questions? We've had some nice in-line questions.
I have lots of questions, but we will just ask one.
Pick a nice one.
Because you mentioned disjunction a few times.
Sorry.
You mentioned disjunction
Yes.
a few times,
Yes.
and I noticed that the only difference between a definitive formula and a code formula is disjunction.
Because the main difference, yeah. I mean, in reality, the definite formula will include universal modification. The goal
quantifier as well, yeah.
Yes. So it's not quite the only difference. There's an important other difference actually, and it does explain why we're not doing quickly semantics actually, and it's this, because it maps through to disjunction actually. It's that if you think about what kinds of implicational formulae are allowed, they're actually quite restricted. So in the definite formulae, you're allowed goal formulae, formulae of the form goal implies definite formula, which you can reduce to goal implies atom. On the right-hand side in goal formulae, the implicational formula of the form definite formula implies goal formula. Now, of course, that's really important because when you're doing the uniform proof thing of stripping off the connectives, you're going to move the thing on the left of the inside of the implication symbol into the program. So it had better be something that's allowed in programs at that point. So it has to be a definite formula. So, and that maps through to, so which I didn't say too much, because when you do the inductive construction of the least fixed point model, you use a satisfaction relation which uses a clause for implication which reflects that constraint. It's not an arbitrary cryptic implication. It's a clause which requires which works by demanding that a formula, a goal formula of the form definite formula implies goal formula strips the definite formula over to the program. Rather than now, if you're thinking of programs as worlds at that point, what you've done instead of working with an arbitrary extension of the world giving meaning to implication, you're just looking at a very restricted extension, which is the addition of the specific definite formula. And that makes a big difference to the semantics. That's what makes the connection work. Although it's a little bit technical to say it like that. But so it's not quite just, and that actually, but if you think about, think that if you just follow through, that's actually going to tell you that you can't quite work with, that it's going to tell you that the version of the semantic of disjunction you get can be read in the inferentialist way, because of the way implications are restricted, and that maps through to the way you interpret the elimination of a disjunction because of the way hypotheses are used in the form, so that it all kind of unpacks. But yeah, so that makes sense. Yeah.
Any more questions? I know you've got lots lined up.
Yeah. Let other people ask.
I'm checking online and nothing coming through yet.
Okay, yes, keep.
We had a very nice question.
Yes, that was Margaret. She's a logic programmer, so that's why. Yeah. But yes, I was the logic programmer in the sort of 80s, 90s.
Right. Yeah.
I'm an elevated engineer rather than a full mathematician like you. Oh, sorry. but, then we thought that was, artificial intelligence, AI, and now we have a completely different artificial intelligence. So have you got any comments on the way AI is?
Yes, I do have lots of comments on that point, actually.
Yeah.
I think, rumours of the death of logic in artificial intelligence are greatly overstated, and for a number of reasons. First, AlphaGo 0 had lots of rules built into it at the bottom, which were logical rules. So, rumours of the absence of logic are already a little bit overstated.
Yes.
From the other, there are many things we can say, but one thing we can say is that even supposing you think that modern AI systems are independent of logical reasoning, supposing you think that, then you're still going to have a problem. You're going to have a problem because at some point, society, through its lawyers, is going to demand that you can give a justification and explanation of what your AI system is doing, and that's going to take the form of regulatory regimes for AI systems. Now, regulatory regimes are going to be written in the language of legal English, and legal English is a relatively simple fragment of logic, and you had better be able to relate the behavior of your AI system to the expression of the requirements that's going to come through legally. So it's going to be necessary to find ways of connecting up behavior of AI systems to their logically expressed properties. And that's not hopeless. Here's a way you
Okay.
might do it. Here's a way you might do it. You might observe that AI systems are kind of dynamical systems represented by systems of differential equations. That's a simplification, but that's not bad. Well, systems of differential equations can be represented in terms of discrete systems called process algebras. Right? And once you have process algebras, which are algebraic treatments of dynamics, then those things come along with logics of state. So those logics of state tell you what happens when a system represented in that way executes. Okay. Well, okay. So now I've got a logical formula which describes what happens when a system executes, and that system actually is a representation of the dynamical systems I started out with. Okay. So what I need to do now is relate those logical properties to the regulatory regimes going to come down from the lawyers. And we know that kind of thing can be done. There are plenty of examples of using logic to talk about legal regimes. So it's not hopeless, but one can imagine making those connections all the way through from regulation to system behavior and back, I suppose.
Yes.
So I think
Are people looking at that?
Yeah.
Any other questions? You can interleave. Oh, Leslie.
we can talk some other time.
I'm sticking with the AI.
Yes, please.
Because, you think AI is going to help doing proofs? So if I was a young researcher now, I'd think, well, perhaps you could put all the Isabel proofs into a large language model.
Doing formal proofs.
Yeah, yes.
So there are people starting to ask the question about how AI ideas can be used to handle the complexities of search spaces.
Yes.
I guess that when will that be useful? That would be very useful if you were dealing with really big search spaces or really complex problems represented logically, which are difficult to make traction at this point.
Yeah.
If you could employ sort of learning techniques to work out what are likely to be good strategies based on the real detail of the structure of the thing they're trying to prove, then maybe that would help.
Yeah, but, Isabel, for example, I'm not an expert on Isabel personally, but has a huge set of proofs sitting out there. They actually publish them all as like a journal.
Yeah,
you could just scoop all that up into a large language model. I think you still need to be sort of interactive in the way you operate it, but I think you could help quite a lot with.
Yeah, so I know somebody who really is doing this, and they're getting good results.
Well, it seems like an obvious thing to try. If I was younger, I'd be doing it.
I was actually having a conversation with a potential PhD applicant recently, and suggesting that actually what would be really interesting would be to integrate at a very basic level, the theory of proof search with a theory of of those kind of learning of tactics and so on. And there could be something interesting to do there, apart from the kind of LLM versions of what are going on.
Yes,
but there might be a really fundamental theory to be sorted out there. I don't know.
Well, I don't know either, but it seems like a possible interesting area. I mean, I know I've heard talks by mathematicians as well on using AI for doing more mathematical proofs and things.
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, logic used to have a place in mathematics, and now it's almost gone. And very few mathematics departments do logic anymore. Logic has moved as a discipline into informatics, computer science department, and it's still in philosophy where it's always been, and actually is having a bit of a revival in philosophy these days, which is nice to see.
Yes,
but it's moved over to those two disciplines rather than. I mean, there is stuff going on in what's called mathematical logic and mathematics departments, but it really is model theory and set theory, and model theory is quite, as it's done, is very beautiful mathematics, but it's quite separated from logic as the account of reasoning. It's not very much to do with the theory of reasoning anymore, and which is one of the reasons we like this stuff, right? Because it is about the theory of reasoning. It's grounding meaning in inference and reasoning, and that's kind of a nice place to play.
all your thoughts. Any more questions? Bill, did you ask all your questions?
Yeah, I'm just blown away, really. I'm very familiar with classical logic, and I can see a lot of correspondences. So I could follow. I could follow the talk from that point of view. But this is really educational, to see this larger view of the world. But it leaves so many questions unanswered, of course.
Sure. Absolutely, there are very many questions we have.
It wouldn't be research otherwise.
So one thing we haven't done with this stuff yet, although I'm talking to a potential student about doing it, is look at arithmetic theories as well. A big part of logic over its mathematical history has been about studying arithmetical theories and their model-theoretic and proof-theoretic properties. And the proof theory of theories of induction is deep and beautiful and complicated. And so we can ask, can we incorporate a sensible notion of arithmetic theory into this worldview? I'm sure we can. I'm equally sure it'll be quite a lot of work. It'll be quite challenging. So that's something I'd like to see happen. In theories of arithmetic and induction and recursion from this point of view. I mean, there's this beautiful hierarchy of theorem, called the Kreisel-Parsons-Mintz theorem, which sets up a systematic correspondences between theories of induction and theories of recursion. And so, if you take classical logic with what's called sigma-1 induction, which is inductive formally with one existential quantifier front and then quantifier free formula, that theory of induction, quite restricted, corresponds to primitive recursive functions in the sense that primitive recursive functions are formally a model of logic with sigma induction. And then the next step up might be something called pi 2 induction, where you allow yourself for all x there exists y formula for induction. If you go to that step, then you get partial recursive functions, I think. I think partial recursive functions are a model of that. I think it's at some point primitive recursive functionals come in as well. I forget, I've forgotten right now exactly what the hierarchy is. But this hierarchy of correspondences between strength of induction and strength of recursion. And all that relies on it relies on being able to set up the proof theory of induction on the one hand, and a very simple notional model on the other. And you actually have the recursive functions will be a model of the inductive logic. But it will be fascinating to reconstruct something from this point of view, especially given the connections that we've begun to see that exist between computation and inferential semantics. So, I think there's a world there to be explored.
I would admire the courage of people that can throw away so much, like in intuit. I've got much more an idea of the motivation now after this talk. But proof by contradiction, the square root of 2 is irrational. It's got a long history.
I mean, classical systems fit perfectly well into this framework. It's just that for the purposes of today, it was nicer to talk about intuition. I mean, just because I thought we could get to computation quite directly like that. And I thought you might appreciate that. But and I think Peter would have appreciated it for that one. But yeah, classical stuff fits perfectly well.
So I have a remark more than a question, but
yeah.
So you can do all of this for classical logic, and the way you do it is actually by simplifying the semantics, not by adding stuff to it. So you actually simplify the notion of rule, you get rid of a couple of connectors, and you recover a complete description of classical logic. And that work was the motivation for that work goes back to some philosophy where they ask, is there a way of expressing classical logic that doesn't assume bivalence? The answer is yes. So this was some work from 2009, 2005 by George Lundquist on which much of this talk is based. So that's been really interesting.
Anyone online?
Well, just got a comment coming through from Ian, who's actually just left. He said I finished my AI MSc as the debate turned to going back to symbolic methodologies, the current connectionist view is hitting limitations due to computational effort involved. There has to be a lower energy way to get machines smarter.
Nice comment.
Yes. The brain is a very efficient computer, isn't it?
We get less
Power,
efficient.
power rise.
We get less efficient as the years.
Yes, but it's still more efficient than what we can build.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, I must say this in the last few years, getting into this worldview, it's been fascinating. It's been the most interesting period of my research career.
Well, yeah,
It's been by a long way. I mean, it actually made me realise that. I mean, I started talking to Samson one day about what we were doing. I was like, this proof-theoretic stuff these days. He said, no, but you've been doing that all your life, really, haven't you? And he was right, actually. It's just that the available environment of ideas has kind of got a lot richer in recent years, and that's made some things that one was thinking about over many decades become much more comprehensible than they ever were, because there's a better way of thinking about them now, and that's been interesting too. Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Well, on that optimistic note, I'll say thank you. The income continues, so just opposite, there should be some refreshments, wine, juices.